Hi, folks. Welcome to this class that we're providing as part of our non-funded assistance project under Project Catalyst. This is going to be an overview of the reasons why projects don't get funded. It's a repeat of a process that we did during Fund 11, and that was quite popular and most people found useful. And so we're going to be doing it again for Fund 12. Part of this will be looking at the old data versus the new data. There have been changes to how things are running within the Project Catalyst execution and parameters, but I think most of it will be familiar, and then we'll present a few elements of the overall strategy that we recommend when submitting to Project Catalyst based off these kind of new dynamics and voting patterns. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. Feel free to interrupt me with questions if something doesn't seem obvious or make sense. I'm happy to discuss things in detail. So first, we'll start with a review of the results for Fund 11. Fund 11 not having the real world partnerships category, and we'll take a look at that. So here were the statistics from Fund 11. We put this board together really on our own initiative and not knowing how useful it was. We figured it was publicly available information and that everyone kind of already knew this stuff, and we were the ones who were learning about it. But generally, the feedback has been that this was quite useful to people who didn't necessarily know where to get the voting results and didn't necessarily know how to analyze them. So generally speaking, if you look at the color coding on this board, the green areas are areas where things are easier to get approval on. The yellow areas are kind of in the normal area, and the red areas are areas that are more difficult to match. So for example, if we take the open developers line, which is all the open source development that is done within the Project Catalyst program, you'll see that overall, it was much easier to get funded when you were doing open source development for the benefit of the ecosystem. And that makes sense, right? Because it is to the ecosystem's advantage to fund people who are adding value to the ecosystem, making it easier for people to build in it and creating tooling that makes developers' lives easier. So it had a whopping 64.57% funding rate. And that was only matched by the system category, which doesn't really count because it's core development that's done for the benefit of the ecosystem by the origin body. So it wasn't really kind of something that most people can compete for. In the open developers category, you'll also see that the budget is mostly kind of built to suit. So only 8.6% of proposals were out of budget. That means that they got the right amount of votes, but there wasn't enough money left. And then it's also the category with the most funded projects at 82, with a minimum voting power of 52 million and 265 votes, which is a little bit higher for both. So what should you draw from this? You could say that this is a very vibrant category, that it was a category in which it was a little bit harder to reach the minimum threshold in order to get funded, right? You can get approved and not funded, but in order to get funded, you needed 52 million in votes. And you needed an almost overwhelming majority of yes votes in order to get funded, which means that basically you had to have a solid project in open developers in order to get approved. If I compare that to open ecosystem, which is all the marketing requests and community building requests and event requests and kind of the non-development oriented requests, there's only a 25% pass rate in that. For a same number of projects. So if we look at the numbers in a different way, you can see that there were many more proposals in this category than in the open developer category. And that the minimum voting power was actually right at the defined limit, which means that the main reason those 75% of people didn't get approved in the open ecosystem category is that they didn't have a strong enough project to draw enough yes votes to get approved. And you generally needed twice as many yes votes or as many yes votes as no votes in order to be in the approved category in open ecosystem. So it's somewhat of a contentious category. So if all of that's clear, again, I think the main interest now is to understand what the new dynamic is. So I'll stop the run through there, but obviously you can look at our previous presentation that goes through this in detail and see exactly how everything panned out. But now let's move on to Fund 12. Now, again, in Fund 12, we had some new dynamics, which included the real world partners category, and we'll explain how that changed things. Because people found this so useful, we also went into a little bit more depth in terms of understanding what the different things are. So you'll see that I've got some graphs that go into more detail on how things ran, and we'll be able to kind of dive in and see why things might have been different in Fund 12. So reason number one that people didn't get funded was that not enough wallets participated in voting. Now, if you remember going back to Fund 11, let me just go back to that slide. Here, generally, we're looking at between 200, 265, 283 in terms of numbers of wallets that might have been necessary in order to get funded. And here we have 261, 145, 156, 232, and 247. So in general, we can definitely say that the number of wallets that needed to participate in voting for a project was lower. Now, there's a couple different interpretations we could make of that data point. A is that fewer voters with larger wallets were participating in the round, so more whales and fewer shrimps. Two, you could say that less ADA was required to get funded, and we'll check that number to see if that assumption is true. Or C, we could say that the same amount of voters with consolidated wallets were participating in the round. So what does that mean is that in Fund 11, a certain number of voters use multiple wallets to vote, versus Fund 12, those same people use fewer wallets to vote. And how would we know that? I guess the main way would be to see if we got a decrease in the amount of wallets, we would expect to get a decrease in the amount of voting power in each category. Unless it was the same voters with the same voting power and less wallets, then we would get a steady state in the number of wallets. Generally speaking, so though the averages of numbers of wallets were about the same, and even sometimes higher, especially for the real world partners category. You can see that the minimum amount of people who voted in that category were 887 in terms of those that got passed, and it had about a 50% pass rate of those that got voted on. And so it was a high interest category, but it was also a category with very few projects in it, 12. Now, is that the actual number of real world partnership submissions that were made? No, those were the ones that made it through committee screening and qualified based off the minimum amount of annual revenue and many other factors that caused only 12 projects to make it through to the final. Just keep that in mind as we go forward. And then another note is that one of the reasons why the minimum amount of voting power might have been reduced from 500 ADA to 25 is, again, because of that lower number of wallets participating. We can hypothesize that Catalyst or the origin bodies decided to lower the amount so that they get more participation because democracy is good. Reason number two that proposals did not get funded was that they didn't have enough voting power behind them. And so, again, looking at the categories, we can see that in the open ecosystem and use cases concept category, the minimum amount of voting power is about the same, right? 48 million or 47 million. So there, we were mostly the same. In Cardano open developers, if we go back to this one, we saw minimum voting power was 52 million here. And in Fund 12, it was 81. So it actually went up. So remember, we had that hypothesis of why are there fewer wallets involved in the voting? Is it because there are fewer people, or there are the same amount of people with fewer wallets? And I think the fact that in the open developers category and in the use cases category, there was a higher minimum in terms of getting a project funded. would indicate to me that it's the same people using fewer wallets. And why might that be? Is there more consolidation in wallets? Did they feel less incentive to spread their voting power among multiple wallets? There's many different reasons that it could be, but in general, what I would conclude from that is that the reduced number of wallets, even though it led to potentially a reduction in the minimum voting power to participate, is not as big of an issue for decentralization as it would initially appear, because the voting power involved was more or less the same. And so more participation is obviously great, but it does look like the same or more voting power was represented. We can also look at the real world category and see that a significantly higher amount of minimum voting power was involved. But again, if we look at the amounts of wallets, which were about 4x as much, and we look at the amount of voting power, which is about 4x as much, that also makes sense. So again, same average size of voting power distributed over fewer wallets. Which brings about the question is, do you need whales to get funded? And so in terms of how decentralized governance works within Cardano, we know that there's a fixed supply of 45 billion ADA. And we know that 46.6% is owned by whales and exchanges. And I mean really, really big whales and big exchanges. But we also know that on average, only 10% of the total voting supply votes. So in terms of whether the small wallets are relevant, we can say yes, because since you're dealing with a much smaller quantity of voting power, and many of those other voting blocks are non-active and non-registered, the smaller votes are relevant. It does take at least 45 million in ADA of voting power to get funded. And so that means that you do need an average voting power among your yes voters to be around 220,000 ADA, which when we did this study was about 70,000 US dollars and now is a little bit more. So it's not a trivial amount, right? This is not people who are lightly invested in Cardano, or at least not lightly invested at the moment of the voting snapshot. But it is also not people who are enormously wealthy and concentrating or concentrating that wealth in Cardano. So what we usually tell people is, number one, remember that Cardano is an ecosystem, and that even though someone might be a shrimp in their investment in Cardano or in their wealth overall, they are likely connected to whales, and they are likely connected to what we call orcas, who are kind of those people who individually have around 220,000 ADA, which would be the average amount of voting power you'd need per wallet in order to get approved. And also it's completely worthwhile to branch out to them and meet these people and ask them to introduce you to people who are specialized in the area that your project is in, and who are connected to other people who might have the voting power in the ecosystem, because again, everything is interconnected. It's good to meet people in town halls, Discord, or Twitter. It's good to talk to people, tell them why you're doing what you're doing, tell them about your project and why it's different. Find out what's already out there. I think during the community reviews this year, I saw a number of projects that were recreating some tooling or projects that were already existent in the open source library of Cardano. And if they talked to more people, maybe they would have known on that and then built on top of those things instead of recreating them. Or maybe they would have presented the difference between what they were doing and what was already in the open source library more clearly in their proposal, and I probably would have given them more credit. But in any case, I think it's good to meet people, and it doesn't pay off to only be connected to one whale or a few orcas in order to get approved. There was a big issue in Fund 10 where people could vote against projects, and that led to a lot of political maneuvering and some bad feelings on people who participated in that round. I think it's worthwhile taking a look at whether having a high number of abstain votes matters. And so we looked at the average, which is in green here, and then the high and the low number across categories. And what you can see with the projects that have a really big bar is that you could have had, for example, in open developers, 17 million in voting power abstaining, or 106 million of voting power abstaining, and you still could have gotten approved and gotten funded. And what that tells you is on those big bar categories, that whether people abstained or not just didn't matter. And it was more about finding your tribe, your people, the people who care about your project, who want to see it implemented, or devs who have a use for that piece of tooling and that are going to vote for you, and having that right number of wallets and that right amount of voting power saying yes mattered a lot more than people saying no. In the open ecosystem category and in the product category, this is less true, right? If you had more than 58 million in abstains, you probably weren't getting funded. And if you had more than 59 million in product, you probably weren't getting funded. And that isn't because they count against you. It's just that every vote matters, and these are much more competitive categories. And so if you had those high abstain rates, it was probably that there was something that needed to be improved in your proposal. And you can go on Lido Nation, even if you're not in the voting app, and see all the community reviews that are assigned to your proposal. And that's usually a good place to take a look. And generally what we tell people is if you've got a 4 out of 5 in scoring across impact, feasibility, and value for money on your proposals from the community reviewers, you're probably fine. There's not a lot of people who go into things with 5 out of 5 stars. But if you've got a 3 out of 5 in a category, there's probably a reason for that. And that is an indication that you need to do some work on your proposal to improve it or make it clearer. A lot of times it's just there's not enough information about why your project is going to have a positive impact on the ecosystem, why you are the right person to implement this and likely to succeed in doing it, and why the budget is within industry norms or even cheap against those industry norms. And so these are all things that you can do to make your project clearer and more likely to be approved. The real world proposal partnerships category was a little bit different, both because it went through a committee process before getting voted on, and also because the funding was so much bigger that it attracted a lot more attention. But you can see that that was also a category in which a large number of abstain votes, comparatively to the minimum, did have an impact and was an indication that you probably weren't going to get funded. So the question many people might ask in Fund 12 is, why did fewer projects get funded? And the answer for that is fairly simple. We were given as a community the same amount of money, but there were many more projects submitted. And in fact, I think we went from 900 projects in Fund 11 to 1,200 in Fund 12. Of those projects, so that would already be in terms of averages, an increase in projects of 30%. On top of that, a very large chunk of the money available or the ADA available was devoted to the Cardano Partners category. And so it makes sense that if you have more projects competing for a smaller pool of money with similar amounts of money per project, then you would get a lower pass rate and fewer projects going through. In general, you can still see that the open developer category is still the best place to be in terms of your likelihood of getting approved. The open ecosystem category and the use case concept category, which were a little bit lopsided before, are pretty much equal in Fund 12. So there's no advantage over going one versus the other. Use cases or the MVP category, which was collapsed in Fund 13 into the concept category, was a little bit lower, and the product category was a little bit higher. So, and I think that's probably because people who would have thought about doing products maybe decided to go for a real world partnership instead. The 50% real world partnership pass rate is a little bit misleading, and I'll tell you why. We think, based off our impressions before they went through screenings, that there were probably about 60 projects that actually went to the committee and were submitted in the real world partnership category, but only 12 of those came out of the committees. So your real pass rate for real world partnerships is probably closer to 10% or maybe even lower if we get rid of the automatic archivals. And that seems to make sense based off the amount of money available. One of the other things that's really worth noting is that there was 2.7 million ADA left over in the concept category. Well, what does that mean? That means that in the concept category of the proposals that were put forward, there were at least 20 projects that could have got funded that didn't do enough marketing or didn't have a clear enough proposal in order to cross over that minimum threshold, and therefore didn't get approved. But the money was there, and instead of going to projects that were voted in by the community, it got rolled over into the leftover category for other projects that were previously voted in, but maybe didn't reflect the current desires of the community. So it's a little bit of a waste. And so the lesson learned here, if you are proposing to Catalyst and Fund 14 or thinking about how to engage with the ecosystem, is that in the concept category in particular, you really need to go out there and make sure that people are seeing your project or understanding what the value is and are coming to vote. Because that really was not a question of competition. It was just a question of not getting enough eyeballs and enough voting power on those projects. What else changed in Fund 12 in terms of the amounts of ADA that were requested? I think for the most part, the trends were generally the same. When we look at the amount requested in each category, there were a few projects that requested the maximum amount for those categories. But generally speaking, most people aimed slightly below, let's say about 20% below the maximum. And that seems to be the sweet spot in terms of the community voting yes, is not kind of being greedy, at least in the perception of things, but going slightly below. And then there's a tactical reason to do that also, which is that once a category starts running out of budget, they will skip over projects that are over the remaining budget. So let's say that category starts out with 8 million ADA, and then as projects get approved in that category, it decreases to 7.7, 7.4, 7.1 million. And then eventually it gets to below the maximum for that category. And let's say that the amount in the category is now 100,000 ADA is remaining in the budget. That means that every project that is in at 300,000, at 200,000, at 150,000 is getting skipped. And the first project to have 99,999 or even exactly 100,000 is going to be the next project approved to deplete the rest of that budget. And so it is probably a good idea, if you're putting forward multiple proposals, to have one of those proposals in a category that you've submitted many proposals to, aim for a requested amount that is targeting that lower limit, that smaller amount that was left over in the previous round. And that can be a way to kind of game your submission process and make sure that as an approved project, you're able to extract that last bit of value from the category. Which is just what I talked about here. I'll leave the slide up for a second so that people can see it, but essentially that is exactly what we talked about. For open developers, the quantity that you should target if you want to have that leftover amount is 100,000 ADA. And for the use case product, 180,000 ADA is a good number to target. Now, this was our general Catalyst strategy that we shared with people who we helped on board. And I'll tell you why it's good. I'll walk you through it first, but then I'll tell you why it's good for both the proposer and for the ecosystem. So what you can see here is the first separator in terms of categories is, do you as a proposer, including any partners you're bringing into the proposal, have $5 million US in annual recurrent revenue? And If the answer is yes, then you qualify for the partners category, and the answer is no, then you don't, unless you bring in a partner who can bump you over that top. And so where we go across the top there are the things that you need to qualify in order to stay in the partners category, right? Would your proposal drive mass awareness or adoption? Would it require more than 1 million ADA? Have you received Catalyst funding before? And if you have received Catalyst funding before, are you aware that you can only take up to 30% of the partners category funding? Is that enough to do what you need to do out of the partnership versus your partners who have not been funded by Catalyst before? And again, if multiple partners are in a project that is receiving this partner category and you have all been part of Catalyst before, the total all of you together can get is 30% of the total funding. So really keep that in mind. Which may mean that going through one of the traditional categories is a better answer for you. But if you have the right answers for all of those things, then you can submit a partner proposal. Just be aware, again, that this is a very competitive category, and you only really have a 10% chance of getting that proposal through. But even if you do that, you should probably submit some smaller ones as a backup anyway. Just make sure that your categories or the work that you're going to do doesn't overlap, or if it's a duplicate, that it's in addition to, not a duplication of projects. Because if a duplication is detected, then the projects will automatically get archived. If you do not have 5 million ARR between you and partners, then you're going to use the traditional Catalyst categories. And the first thing that we usually recommend to people is when you have a choice, don't just submit one big project in the product category. Break your project into smaller categories. So for example, do one section on marketing to get more users to come into the ecosystem, do another one to develop a concept for a new feature, and do another one to launch a new module on your product. And each of those should be a separate product. And the reason for that is that if you put it all in product, which is one of the highly competitive categories, then you have a high chance of not getting anything from Project Catalyst. But if you split your project into multiple categories, then you have at least a chance of getting something in a category. So that's the reason why it's better for the proposer. And the reason it's better for the ecosystem is that by splitting the different components of the project, you're giving the ecosystem and the voters more opportunities to decide what are the parts of your project that are most valuable to Cardano, not just to you. And while you may not agree with that judgment, maybe you think that all of your project is extremely valuable to Cardano. It does give the community more choices and more granularity and more options when it comes to deciding what is good for it. And that overall is better for you and better for the community. Now remember that the ecosystem open proposal is often a higher category chance. But generally in this one, it was a little bit lower just because of how the votes turned out. In the open source developers was the highest, which again makes sense, right? That's going to be the one where it benefits the ecosystem the most because they're getting reusable tools that they can use and that other developers will be able to use to build with, and it's making things better for everyone. So a little bit higher chance of approval and a little bit less competitive than just the open category in which you can do anything. If you have an already fully operational solution, then technically you fall into the product proposal, which strangely enough had a higher pass rate than the concept category, which is usually where we recommend people deviate to. So I guess in this last round, the product proposal was a better category to be in, probably again because the partner proposal drew off some of the bigger projects and pulled them into a slightly more competitive and larger category. Generally speaking, the higher the maximum amount of money per category, the harder it's going to be to get your project approved. So just keep that in mind as a rule of thumb when you're doing your proposals. Again, our general observations when it comes to projects that don't get funded, it's the main reason is they didn't put their projects in front of the right people, and people weren't aware of their project to go vote for it. I think, again, both the Catalyst Town Hall and the regional town halls are a really great place to put your project forward. And it's also usually in the Discord channels for all of those. They have a section specifically for people to talk about their projects, to answer questions. And maybe if you do that before the lockout period for edits, you can get a little bit of feedback and present a better proposal. Overall, when looking at people who stick with the ecosystem and stick with multiple submissions over multiple funds, what I've found is that people get better at putting projects together that speak to the community over time. But that it is a learning curve, and getting feedback early is going to increase your chances. Secondly, they need to choose the right category and break the projects into components to stand a higher chance. Again, if you do an all or nothing bid into the product category, you only have a, let me look at that again, a 23% chance. Whereas if you broke that into multiple projects, up to 6 of them, and you split that between, you'd have a higher chance of getting something to do something. And instead of either a small chance to get funded for a big amount or nothing. So I think that's usually better for the proposer, and again, better for the ecosystem. And then smaller and more numerous independent projects create more choices and opportunities for the ecosystem as a whole. I think that's generally a good thing. We're gonna add a little bit of a bonus section to this, which is down to the last checks that you should do before edits get locked out. And these are really things that we've learned the hard way. So when you enter the final period, usually the 6 days after, or 3 to 6 days after submission ends, and you can still edit your project, these are things that you should really check. And they're things that can save you a lot of pain, especially if you get funded. So the first thing is that you should make sure that your project is planned to be completed within 12 months. And I say this because that is the maximum duration that projects are supposed to last in Catalyst. Now, it doesn't mean that if you run 12 months in one day in terms of the actual execution of your project, or you're waiting for a review, that you're automatically going to get kicked out. I've seen projects that lasted up to 2 years, though often in those cases, the project teams are no longer together or able to deliver, but it is possible to close out a project in a longer period than 12 months, but it has to be planned around 12 months. And I definitely saw one project that had a 2-year rolled out when I was doing community reviews this time around. And even if they make it to voting, I think the milestone reviewers are probably going to force them to compress that into a 1-year time frame, and that's not going to be comfortable for that team if they thought they were going to have 2 years to do it. So they may have to withdraw, or they may get archived if someone catches it. So it's really something to keep in mind. Remember, there's usually multiple funding rounds per year, except for that Fund 10 situation. So think of your planning. If you've got a 12-month execution, you know that somewhere in there, if you need to make adjustments or add scope that wasn't in the original project, again, you can't have duplication, you can't get paid twice for the same work. But if you need to add scope, there should be an opportunity to do that later. We also have found that sometimes when you don't know what you need to build yet, it's fine to structure your milestones in a way where the future execution is dependent on the results of the previous milestone. Just be very clear about that in your milestones and in your project description, so that the milestones reviewers can easily adapt to that. The second thing that you need to do during the period during which the project is being closed out is make sure that the amount of ADA that you requested is within the category limits. And again, we learned this the hard way, and it's really unfortunate. But most people know that it's they need to check that it's not over the maximum for the category. So for example, you wouldn't want to put 500,000 ADA in the ecosystem open category. But be aware that there is a minimum too. So I think it's 15,000 ADA for some categories, and it's 500,000 ADA for the real world partnerships. And that means that if you are either below the minimum or above the maximum, at some point the project may be automatically archived. And if it's after those projects have already moved forward in the review process, there's nothing Catalyst will be able to do for you. Another thing that we've seen, and it's something that we do also, we prepare our project proposals in a Google Doc or a Word document, and then we paste them into the app once that's done, because it's easier to save drafts and work on it that way. But typically we use 1,000 separators when we're writing out our numbers. And if you paste a number that has commas in it into the field in the proposal submission, it will register as 0 because it will reject that submission. So be careful if you're going quickly and you're trying to cut and paste these things in at the last minute, that you don't end up with a 0 number, which again would be below the minimums for all categories and would get your project automatically archived. And the last thing that we usually tell people, and this is actually something that you need to keep in mind if your project is going to be approved, as well as if you're trying to get it approved, have detailed milestones. And there's several reasons why you should do this. The first is that if you don't have detailed milestones and a community reviewer looks at your project, it's going to be very difficult, unless you have done 1,000 projects on Catalyst and Cardano before, which is the case sometimes. People have done many projects successfully, and they can just say, look, I've done this before, and that's why I'm going to be able to do this. But if you don't have detailed milestones, it's very hard for a community reviewer to be able to tell if you know how to do this or not. Detailed and granular milestones are a great way to prove that you know what you're doing. And they're also a great way for a community reviewer to know that if at some point the process fails, you either have a plan to be flexible, or the payments will stop. And in both cases, that protects the treasury. So it's really important in terms of the quality and people knowing to vote for the feasibility of your project, that you have detailed milestones. The second reason is that if you get funded and you don't have detailed milestones, the first thing that you're going to have to do is you're going to have to rewrite them. Because one of the steps in order to actually start your project is to create a statement of milestones, which is a list of all the outputs, acceptance criteria, and evidence that is needed for your project to be considered complete by the milestone reviewers. And they will not let you move on to project execution and funding until you have one that is reflective of what was approved by the community. Now, the easiest way for you to have a statement of milestones that is reflective of what was approved by the community and meets the minimum requirements of Project Catalyst is to make sure that the milestones that you list in your proposal already meet the minimum requirements of Project Catalyst. But if you don't do that, that leaves a lot of room for interpretation and kind of guessing on both sides by both you and the milestone reviewers of what milestones would satisfy the much broader description of your project that was approved by the community. And that's going to get you in trouble, because generally you have a set of milestones in mind based off the costs that you put forward. And if there's ambiguity in it and the milestone reviewer is erring on the side of being conservative and protecting the community and making sure that they get value for money out of your proposal, then you may be in a situation where you don't make any profit, you either break even or you lose money, even if you execute everything within bounds. And that's not even counting the market risk that may move with or against you. So make sure that you look at projects that were actually completed, look at the milestones of projects that were actually completed, and make sure that you have a statement of milestones that can just be cut and pasted from your proposal straight into the milestones tool. And that is going to save both you and the community reviewers a lot of pain when it comes to the execution of your project. Thanks for listening. This was DJ Bodden from Storm Partners. I work closely with ecosystems on helping them grow and helping the community grow within the ecosystem. You can always contact us at Storm Partners or find us in the Catalyst network chat. We're happy to talk about what makes a good proposal, and we are participants in the community, so you can find us in the various channels. We'll also be voting this round. So looking forward to looking at some great proposals and then seeing everyone again for Fund 14 in 2025. Thanks so much and have a fantastic day.